Hey everybody, it's Phil Struzzulo from Select Software Reviews, and today we're going to learn a lot about leave management and leveraging technology for employee leave. I personally don't know a lot about this topic, and so I'm super curious to dig in. We've got an expert. Lauren Dye is the COO and co-founder of Cocoon, which is a technology platform designed to help companies with this specific part of the employee lifecycle. Lauren, thanks a lot for joining us. Do you mind giving a little bit of background on yourself and what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Thanks for having me, Phil, and great to connect with everyone on the line here. I'm Lauren, and my background is in the world of software, actually. But previously to starting Cocoon, I was in the world of fintech at Stripe, along with my co-founders who were at similar companies, actually Stripe and Square. And Cocoon is really focused on leave management, which for those of you who've been HR folks supporting people through these experiences, it can be really challenging, whether it's a parental leave when someone's having a baby, for example. I actually just got back from my own parental leave recently with a 6-month-old at home. It could be a caregiver situation where someone in your family is sick, or your own health. And what we saw as founders who were starting our own families was that it is really difficult to figure out your time, what you're eligible for, and also how to get your pay during leave. We actually had a friend of ours who was on the legal team go through the experience of literally being wheeled into her C-section in the hospital room and trying to bring her laptop with her to apply for disability insurance, just so she could figure out paying her mortgage on the other end once she had her baby. And it was experiences like that that just really got us thinking, why is this so difficult for those of us who need leave, and also for HR teams who are figuring this out from a compliance, legal, insurance, and payroll perspective? And so what Cocoon does is we build powerful tools to make it easy for both HR teams to manage leave and then for employees to take it.
That's awesome. And so I guess you're sort of tying into the payroll system, perhaps the HRIS, employee handbook, and stitching all these together so that somebody can understand the information that they need and then also apply for leave. Is that like sort of accurate?
That's a really great way to describe it. And the stitching together is exactly the big challenge. So just to give people a little bit of the 30,000 foot view, when it comes to leave, there are 3 key things that are really difficult. The first piece is compliance. So as an HR team, many of you probably have teams that are now distributed across states. A lot of our customers are in 30, 40 states. And there's been this explosion of regulation around leave as well, especially coming off COVID. And so what we see is that keeping up with regulatory landscape when it comes to job protection, compliance notices, for instance, is extremely difficult for HR teams. The second piece is really around stitching together an understanding of your time. So what time an employee has available to them to take away from work. And this has a lot to do with the fact that there are laws at a federal level, for instance. There are laws at a state level, like, for example, California Family Rights Act. There are also even municipal laws around leave in terms of time that's job protected, for example. Layer on top of that, speaking of stitching together, the company's policy around their leave, like you may have a policy as a company that says we offer 12 weeks of parental leave, for instance, to any parent, and then additionally time from or time and pay that you might get from a disability insurance provider. You're having to really squish all of those, or stitch together, to use your words, Phil, all of those pieces of information and data points in order to figure out your time. And then the third piece is really pay, which is super important because for most of us, we don't necessarily have the ability to go without income for, call it, 12 weeks or even less than that, for instance, even 2 or 3 weeks. And income during leave is surprisingly complicated, where this was in the case of, for me, previously to starting Cocoon, I thought that people just went on leave and it was like PTO, where you would just put out of office in your calendar and that was it. And I didn't know about this whole world of state applications to disability programs and paid family leave programs, which is as gnarly as getting paid for unemployment insurance for anyone who's experienced it. And then also disability insurance from providers, whether it's a Guardian or a Prudential or a MetLife, et cetera. It's like doing your taxes, trying to figure out how to get access to these funds. And so from an HR team's perspective, what we see is that it's really difficult to support people through this and also manage it on as you have folks going on leave. And then for employees, it can be a really, really challenging experience during a time when, for me at least, it's like, got a screaming baby in the background. I'm trying to figure out how to breastfeed, and a really intense time in our lives.
Yeah, I know for me in Massachusetts, I was on the board of the local SHRM chapter. And I think that for the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, we probably had a webinar a month for a year, and they were all like jam packed, right? Like everybody was on these things. There were tons of newsletters, tons of questions. It's just like so important. It's so complicated. And can you talk a little bit about why this is such an important part of the employee life cycle?
I will steal the words of my former chief people officer at Stripe, because I think she put it the best, which is there are very, very few moments in an employee's career when it's an inflection point. And they can either fall that much more in love with the company or completely out of love with the company. And leave is one of those very few inflection points where that happens, because you've got a person in a very acute moment in their lives, whether it's, having a baby, someone in their family maybe has cancer, for example. And if they feel like their company stepped up for them during that time and made them feel supported and made their experience as easy as it possibly could be, despite everything that's happening in their lives, that is when you can win their loyalty for life. And so when I think about the reason why this is so important, talent is a key piece of it, especially retaining talent. And I think we saw this, especially with COVID, where women, for example, dropped off from the workforce in the millions, in particular, caregivers in general. And a stat that I like to go back to is the fact that 1 in 5 people in America are caregivers. And that means that all of us at some point are going to need leave, whether it's for ourselves or for someone else. And that is a pool of talent that is really, really important to figure out how to attract and also retain, especially your tenured talent who have been growing their careers with your companies for some time, and they're going through this life cycle experience. Really, really important to figure out how can we retain them once they're ready to come back into the workplace, which is quite challenging, especially someone who's come back from parental leave myself recently. It's not easy to figure out how to ramp back in.
And I would imagine because it is so important to people's lives, it's going to be a voter issue. And so these rules and regulations are just going to continue to change at a rapid rate, and they're going to be bespoke to municipalities, to states. Are there any specific tactics that you would tell an HR team today, like, hey, like make sure you get like X, Y, and Z correct when it comes to employee leave?
Yes, yes. So a couple things. One is what I would do is really, from a compliance perspective, I would really make sure that you can, one, leverage employment counsel to the extent that that's something that you have access to ensure that your compliance notices at a baseline level are up to par. And once you have that down, that's really important to also review on a regular basis, because as these laws are changing pretty regularly, those compliance notices, for instance, also need to change. And what I would say is, from a tips perspective, we'll actually share over for the listeners, Phil, a checklist on compliance that could be really, really easy to just for folks to go through in case you don't necessarily have an employment counsel in house, for instance, that you can just tick through. So that's one kind of tactic there. The other piece is really when it comes to folks who are figuring out what their policies are, benchmarking is super important. What we hear a lot from our customers is that they often don't know what the right policy should be. And it can be extra challenging because perhaps they're figuring out their policy when they've got folks across, 20, 30 states. And so what I always like to point folks to is it's all about benchmarking when it comes to leave and your policy, because what folks are going to do is what we're seeing is that as folks are considering job opportunities, they're increasingly asking the questions around, hey, how much leave is there at this company if I were to become a parent, for example? Even sharper questions than that, we've seen people ask questions like, hey, do you have a tenure requirement in order to use leave? Because a lot of companies previously used to have requirements that said, hey, you have to be at the company for at least a year in order to have access to our paid parental leave program, for example. And so the two tips there are, one, from a policy perspective, definitely leverage benchmarks. And we're happy to share over the benchmarks that we've done across the 200 or plus companies that use Cocoon. And then the other piece is I would think a lot about some of these things that are actually in a lot of ways, you could say they're fairly nuanced, like a policy around tenure, but actually make a huge difference to your people. So we've seen people actually turn down jobs because there's a 1-year tenure requirement to get access to the paid parental leave, where they're like, I'm planning to have a family sooner, and that's not going to cut it for me. And so what I would do is also get pretty tactical about the specifics of your policy and train your recruiting team to speak to them.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I'm sure everybody who's listening to this, their personal experience is going to resonate with what you're saying. Like, this is definitely a conversation that you're
Mhm.
having with candidates more and more often. I'm wondering, like, from a HR perspective, and I guess this probably comes down to talent acquisition and retention, but how do you think about the return on investment in having a systematized program that's like easier, somebody's not like taking their laptop into the OR with their C-section, which is quite the image. Uh, and also investing in a program that is going to, perhaps cost more in the near term with offering better terms for your employees.
Yes, that is a question we get a lot, especially right now, because I think a lot of folks are thinking about their costs increasing next year with health insurance costs rising pretty significantly going into 2024. And there's a couple of areas that I would really highlight when it comes to ROI. And a lot of times we have HR leaders ask us, hey, what are the talking points that I should go to my CFO with in order to improve my leave policy or find a partner to help me manage leave? And so let's start with the first piece, which is improving your leave policy, or even just creating a leave policy to begin with. On that front, one of the really, really key pieces there has a lot to do with retention. And so the way I think about it is, what is the cost of having someone go on leave, not actually return, especially one of your most tenured employees, and having to go through another cycle of hiring and actually training that person up? Usually more than that person's salary, actually. And so that's one piece that's really critical to keep in mind. Some of the other areas around ROI that I've been asked a lot about recently have a lot to do with two other pieces. One is around compliance, and actually the second piece is time, frankly. So from a compliance perspective, this is a pretty gnarly topic, and most of us are not employment counsel. And so we don't necessarily have the knowledge base or frankly, the time to keep up with all of these regulations across now 14 states in DC that have paid family leave programs and 30 more that are considering it, for example. And so especially if you're a company with distributed folks across states, the ROI from not spending $1,000 an hour with legal counsel, but instead having a partner kind of help you manage leave can be really meaningful, especially if it's a software partner where it's already embedded within the company's software. And then the second piece really has to do with time for the HR team. And we hear a lot from HR teams as we've been talking to them about the time they spend on figuring out, for example, with an employee, what time they're, or explaining to an employee what time and pay they have access to. We've even had HR teams screen share around the Massachusetts portal or the California portal to help their employees navigate that, for instance. We've had HR teams tell us how painful it is to figure out payroll in terms of, they're on leave in the middle of the pay period. How do you figure out how much you owe them on top of a state program or disability program? So all in all, that typically takes folks 13 hours per leave, which sounds totally mind-blowing, but is actually true, because if you think about things like, let's say, an hour screen share with an employee, for instance, or as someone is changing their leave, or the baby came early or late and their dates change and their payroll changes, all of that really adds up. And so that time savings is huge, especially as HR teams are now running leaner than ever.
It makes a lot of sense. And to be 100% honest with you, this is not something I'd thought much about until this conversation. But as you're sort of getting into it and explaining also the trends here, like it seems really, really important for HR teams to kind of get their heads around this stuff. If somebody is listening to this and it's really resonating with them, is there a good way for them to follow up and connect with you or learn more about this topic?
Yes. Well, please check out our website at cocoon.com. And also feel free to reach out to me personally. I'm Lauren at cocoon.com. Add me on LinkedIn, shoot me an email. Also, we have a wonderful team who's helpful in terms of really guiding folks through this experience of, hey, I'm struggling with supporting my people through leave. Can reach out to our team at sales@cocoon.com as well.
Awesome. Lauren, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it.